Hey guys, tonight we begin in the muck,
Subscribe to my channel.
You wake up in a medieval trench, damp cloak stuck to your legs, a dull ache behind your eyes. It smells like wet leather, bad stew, and the distinct musk of unwashed warriors who haven't bathed since last winter. Around you, the early morning mist curls over a churned-up battlefield. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows mockingly. It's the middle of the 14th century, and you're not a knight, noble, or hero. You're just one of thousands, and you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and the local time down in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take a cautious breath, your nose already protesting the mix of mud, blood, and mildew. There's no dramatic music, no rallying speech, just the quiet dread of dawn before a medieval battle. The kind where nobody knows how many will die, but they all understand it'll be a lot. Medieval warfare isn't fast or clean. It's not cinematic. It's trudging through fields so churned they swallow your boots, carrying a sword that weighs more than your optimism. Most of the army is made up of peasant levies, aka you, poorly trained, questionably sober, and armed with whatever the village blacksmith had lying around. And forget about armor. You're lucky if your shirt doesn't already have holes in it. Still, you're here, because you were told you'd earn land, honor, or at least a decent meal. You'll get none of that, of course. But you will get to witness history's ridiculous obsession with stacking bodies like firewood. Picture this. Toten, 1461. Historians estimate 28,000 to 38,000 people died in just one snowy day of England's War of the Roses. To this day, it's the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. It wasn't heroic. It was chaos. The snow made everything worse. You couldn't see who you were stabbing half the time. The wind howled. Swords slipped from frozen hands, and by the end the nearby river literally ran red. Back then, no one cared about body counts the way we do now. There were no crisp infographics, just oral tales, passed down in pubs. Aye, lad, I counted 20 heads rolling before lunch. Real scientific stuff. And yet these numbers somehow survive. Some exaggerate, sure, but the sheer scale of killing, undeniable. Now imagine standing there, your ankle deep in half-melted snow and blood, your weapon clogged with slush. You look around and see horses screaming, men clutching their throats, others staggering like ghosts, covered in steam and gore. There's no direction, no retreat, just a desperate frozen ballet of death. Meanwhile, your feet have gone numb, not from fear, though that's definitely there, but from the cold. And you realize that dying might not even be the worst part. Living after this might be harder. What's even more insane, most of these conflicts were over lineage, noble families arguing over thrones, while ordinary people like you paid the price in bone and blood. The kings changed, the flags swapped colors, but the killing? That stayed the same, and it wasn't just battles. Starvation, disease, and infighting often killed more than swords. After Toten, many survivors were executed. Captured knights were sometimes ransomed. But peasants? They were just clean-up, replaceable, unnamed. Here's something curious. Historians still argue whether those death tolls include only battlefield casualties, or if they also count the wounded who crawled off and died later in ditches. Record-keeping was, let's say, not great. Monks scribbled whatever they heard from travelers, who may have been drunk or just looking to impress. One chronicler claimed the battlefield was soaked with blood for miles. Poetic but not exactly peer-reviewed. And yet somehow this fuzzy math continues to fascinate us. Even now, archaeologists uncover mass graves from Toten. In 1996, a discovery revealed skulls with horrific blunt force trauma, some crushed as if by sledgehammers. One had over a dozen separate wounds. Gentle reminder, medieval helmets weren't made for comfort, and they definitely weren't perfect protection. Most fighters wore padded coifs or boiled leather caps. If you got hit hard enough, even a helmet just made the splatter more artistic. Want a fringe fact? Some soldiers stuffed straw into their boots as makeshift insulation. Others peed in them before battle. It was believed to warm the feet and harden the leather. You try not to think about this as you watch the enemy line approach, marching like shadows in the mist. Just when you think it can't get worse, someone starts singing. Not a war cry, more like a tired hymn, off-key, shaky. You don't join in. You're too busy trying to keep your nerves from turning your insides to soup. And here's where the dark humor creeps in. Your name probably won't be remembered. No statue, no ballad, just a number in a historian's rough estimate, centuries later. But tonight we remember you, not the kings, not the lords. You, the shivering half-fed soldier with straw in his boots and a cracked wooden shield, standing in snow that smells vaguely of iron and old soup. You're the reason we know these battles mattered, and that's just the beginning. You squint through the swirling snow, your breath catching in your throat as visibility drops to almost nothing. The flakes fall in thick sheets, blurring the outlines of men, blades, and banners alike. All you can hear is the crunch of boots on icy ground, the clatter of steel, and the occasional scream that pierces the wind like a rusty needle. Welcome to the Battle of Towton, 1461, the bloodiest single day in English history. You didn't sign up for a snowball fight, but that's what the weather has turned it into. Except instead of snowballs, it's axes and broad swords, and instead of friendly taunts, it's choking sounds from the guy next to you who just took a halberd to the chest. This is what you get for joining the War of the Roses, a dynastic bickerfest between two noble houses, York and Lancaster, each with a better claim to the throne than the other, if you ask them. And yes, they both have roses as mascots. Cute, right? Not for you, standing in a blizzard with frozen fingers trying to tie a makeshift strap on your splintered shield. You glance down and realize your wool gloves are so stiff with ice that they're basically decorative. In your other hand, a pike, a polearm roughly the height of a small tree, which you've been told to just point at the enemy and try not to trip. The sky is a weird shade of white-grey, and the battlefield near Towton is a wide open field, now slick with a deadly combo of mud, snow, and human fluids. Some of the more experienced soldiers around you are muttering about omens. A raven flew backward that morning. A local priest tripped during mass. You try not to think about it. Then, suddenly, the enemy appears. Blurry figures loom out of the snowstorm like a living wall of shadows. Arrows begin to fly. You barely hear them, but you definitely feel one skim past your ear. You duck instinctively, heart pounding. Historians estimate that between 50,000 and 80,000 men fought at Towton. That might not seem like much today, but in the 15th century it was massive. To put it in perspective, the total population of England at the time was roughly 2.5 million. This was not just a battle, it was a national event. Entire villages emptied their sons onto this field, and you're one of them. The first clash is brutal. Pike meets flesh. Men scream. The snow turns pink, then red, then brown. And unlike modern battles, there's no quick exchange and retreat. Towton lasted for hours, some say 10 hours straight of close combat in freezing conditions. Here's a quirky tidbit. One tactic that helped the Yorkists, your side, let's say, you look good in white, was the wind. The snowstorm blew into the faces of the Lancastrians, obscuring their vision and hampering their archery. The Yorkist archers, meanwhile, had the advantage of wind at their backs and snow out of their eyes. It's the medieval equivalent of winning because the sun wasn't in your team's eyes during the penalty kick. Still, nothing feels victorious when you're knee-deep in slush, swinging your pike like a terrified metronome and dodging men who are very much trying to rearrange your internal organs. Scholars still argue whether the final death toll was closer to 28,000 or 38,000, but either way, the number is stomach-churning. Bodies lay so thick on the battlefield that survivors reportedly used them as stepping stones to cross the field without slipping. It sounds like a horror film, but to those who lived it, it was just Tuesday. Want a fringe fact? A few accounts suggest that some men faked death to survive, lying under corpses, holding their breath, slowing their pulse. One Yorkist soldier later claimed to have hidden beneath two bodies for over an hour, face down in the blood, pretending to be very thoroughly dead. Bold move, effective if you can manage the smell. And it wasn't just the battle itself that was lethal. The retreat was worse. After the Lancastrians broke rank, they tried to flee across the Cockbeck, a river swollen from melting snow. Hundreds drowned. Their armor dragged them under. The river was said to run red with blood for days. A poetic exaggeration, possibly. But even if the river didn't turn crimson, there's no doubt it filled with bodies. You stagger through the aftermath, stepping over twisted limbs and shattered weapons. The snow now lies in dirty heaps, soaked and trampled. You no longer feel your fingers or your feet, but you're alive, and that's something. Your reward, maybe a stale biscuit and the privilege of digging a grave pit. The victorious Yorkists beheaded captured nobles and displayed their heads on spikes at York's Michaelgurt bar. It was both a warning and a celebration, very on brand for medieval England. Still, you survive. You even manage a laugh, bitter and breathless, as someone makes a joke about the romantic nature of spring snow. It's the kind of gallows humor that keeps people sane when the world is a nightmare in slow motion. You don't feel like a hero, you feel like you survived by accident. But in this time and place, that's as close to glory as you're going to get. As night falls, you collapse beside a ruined cart, too exhausted to care about the cold. The snowflakes are thinner now, the storm is fading, and somewhere in the distance, someone starts singing that same tired hymn again. You close your eyes, unsure if you're asleep or simply shut down, and so ends Towton. A blizzard, a battlefield, and enough bodies to silence a country. You open your eyes, but it takes a moment to register where or when you are. The stench is different this time. Less snow and blood, more dust, sweat, and something you can only describe as ancient mildew. You're under the blistering sun now, squinting as flies buzz lazily around your ears. Welcome to the Battle of Cannae, 2116 BCE, where you are about to become a tiny statistic in one of the most efficient mass slaughters in ancient history. You're a Roman soldier, which sounds impressive until you realize you're part of a strategy textbook example in the How to Get Absolutely Wrecked chapter. You and about 80,000 of your comrades are standing on a flat, open plain in southern Italy, baking in bronze armor and leather sandals. You're itchy, you're thirsty, and you've been told that the enemy commander Hannibal is just some Carthaginian lunatic with elephants. This will be easy, they said. Spoiler, it will not be easy. Historians still argue whether Hannibal had divine tactical instincts or whether the Roman command just made every possible mistake that day. Probably both, because while Rome marched in like a hammer ready to smash through a walnut, Hannibal calmly set a trap. His forces were outnumbered. He had maybe 40,000 men, but he arranged them in a crescent formation. You as a Roman are in the middle, facing that crescent like it's a bowl of soup you're about to devour. Except it turns out you're the soup. As the battle begins, the Romans, disciplined and aggressive, push forward. The Carthaginian center falls back, just as expected. Victory feels close, morale is high, but something's wrong. The enemy keeps retreating, curling backward into the crescent shape, and the Romans, unthinking, proud, confident, keep following, deeper and deeper into the bowl. And then, like the snapping of a trap, the sides of the crescent, Hannibal's elite African infantry, close in on your flanks. You are now surrounded. It's not just being surrounded that's terrifying, it's the realization that everyone around you knows it, and there is nowhere to go. The Carthaginian cavalry, after routing your horsemen, swings in behind you to seal the circle. You're packed in tighter than a rush-hour tram in July. You can't even raise your sword. You try to shout, but your voice disappears in the roar of panic and steel. Cannae isn't a battle. It's a compression event. A massive, living, choking human press. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers die in just one day. That's more than double the entire British death toll on D-Day. The ancient historian Polybius called it a massacre disguised as warfare. Want a fringe detail? Some Roman soldiers died not from wounds, but from suffocation and sheer crowding, packed so tightly they couldn't swing weapons or even fall when they were wounded. They just stood, bleeding out, crushed slowly by the shifting mass of bodies. The ground grew slick with blood and trampled limbs. You could hear bones crack beneath sandals. It was said the survivors were too traumatized to speak afterward. And yet, Rome didn't fall. That's the strangest part. Hannibal pulled off the most devastating tactical victory in history, and still lost the war eventually. Scholars still argue whether that was due to his failure to march on Rome immediately, or Rome's stubborn refusal to surrender. Either way, if you were there at Cannae, that strategic debate means very little. You were probably just trying not to die face first in someone else's discarded spear. You crawl over bodies, slipping on shields, pressing yourself behind a fallen cart to gasp for air. Around you, the groans of the dying blend with the clinking of looted armor. Some Carthaginian soldiers take souvenirs, plumes, blades, even sandals. Others are methodical, finishing off the wounded with grim precision. You wonder who's keeping count. The death toll is so high, some sources claim the nearby Aufidus River ran sluggish for days, clogged with corpses. Another ancient writer describes piles of Roman dead that reached to a man's chest. Is it exaggeration? Possibly, but even modern military historians agree. No single day in ancient history comes close to Cannae in terms of concentrated slaughter. A quirky tidbit: after the battle, the Roman Senate supposedly banned public mourning. Too many families had lost sons, brothers, fathers. The city of Rome might have collapsed under the weight of collective grief, so they simply made it illegal to grieve in public. Nothing says keep calm and carry on like a legally enforced emotional shutdown. If you were one of the 10,000 or so Roman soldiers taken prisoner, congratulations. You'd be marched back to Carthage and either sold into slavery or kept in a camp for years, just long enough to hear rumors of your empire slowly, incredibly, rising from the ashes. But if you somehow survived and made it back home, you'd find a city in mourning denial. Your neighbors would pretend your legion never existed. Your commanding officer Varro returned to Rome and was surprisingly spared execution, which tells you a lot about how the Romans handled defeat. They punished you emotionally, not always physically. As night falls over the plains of Cannae, the battlefield begins to quiet. Birds circle overhead. A stray dog gnaws at a helmet strap. You lie flat, heart thudding, trying to look like a corpse. You think about home, about the absurdity of dying in a wheat field because two empires couldn't agree on trade routes and pride. The stars blink awake above the massacre, uncaring and ancient, and you survive. You're sweating before the battle even begins. Not from nerves, though, you have plenty of those, but from the dense, wet tropical heat that clings to your skin like hot syrup. The air smells like rotting fruit and fear. You're in present-day Sri Lanka, but the year is 1409, and you're about to witness one of the least known but deadliest naval massacres in the medieval world. Welcome aboard a Chinese treasure ship, part of Admiral Zheng He's famous armada. An enormous fleet commissioned by the Ming dynasty to show off trade and maybe gently bully the Indian Ocean into compliance. Your ship is massive, about the length of a football field, with sails taller than most buildings back home. The Chinese call these vessels Baochuan treasure ships, and they carry goods, soldiers, translators, and enough bureaucrats to file a war in triplicate. But this isn't a peaceful voyage today. You're docked off the coast of Ceylon, staring at the palm-lined shore where King Alakeshvara, the local ruler of Kotte, has made the fatal error of antagonizing the Chinese Empire. He raided supply lines, insulted ambassadors, and now, brace yourself, he's about to get absolutely flattened. The Chinese have had enough. Zheng He decides it's time for a good old-fashioned punitive expedition, and you, an unlucky sailor armed with a curved dao sword and wearing armor that smells like pickled onions, are along for the ride. You try not to think about it, but you've already seen what happens when Zheng He goes from ambassador to enforcer. It's not pretty. Historians still argue whether this invasion was fully sanctioned by the imperial court, or whether Zheng He was freelancing a bit. Either way, the results are crystal clear. This isn't a skirmish, it's a full-scale amphibious assault, Ming Dynasty style. You hear the first command shouted across the deck. War drums thump like thunder. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers pour into smaller landing vessels, rowboats and flat-bottomed transports bristling with pikes and bows. The shoreline bristles with resistance. Alakeshvara's men are dug in, archers in palm trees, spearmen behind spiky barricades. But the Chinese have something the locals don't: numbers, gunpowder, and extreme motivation. The landing begins. You stumble into the surf, water up to your waist, gripping your weapon with trembling fingers. Arrows whistle overhead, spears jab from the shallows. Somewhere to your left, a man collapses with a gurgling sound, face first into the foam. You don't have time to help, you're already at the beach. The Chinese strategy is swift and overwhelming. They burn Alakeshvara's ships, collapse his forward defenses, and start marching inland. You trudge along, past coconut groves and stunned villagers. Within hours they've reached the capital city. The resistance crumbles. Some accounts say Zheng He captured the king and his entire family by surrounding the palace before they even knew a battle had begun. And here's the kicker: the Ming forces took over 5,000 prisoners in that campaign, including Alakeshvara himself. These weren't just soldiers, they were bureaucrats, nobles, artisans, everyone. Zheng He then shipped them back to China, parading them in the imperial court as a cautionary tale. You can imagine the scene: a tropical monarch in heavy chains, bowing before the emperor, who nods politely before sipping tea. A quirky little footnote: some sources say the captured Sri Lankan royals were later integrated into the Chinese civil system, given positions, land, even wives. From local king to regional administrator, talk about a career pivot. Still, the death toll from the conflict is debated. Official Chinese records, as always, lean toward the diplomatic version: a swift resolution, minimal bloodshed, justice served. But local oral histories and external sources suggest thousands were killed, many in the chaotic beach landings, and during the city's sack. Some stories tell of bodies floating for days in the shallows, their red silk uniforms stained darker by salt and sun. Others mention that the Chinese soldiers constructed temporary cremation sites, their flames visible from ships moored miles offshore. Historians still debate whether Zheng He's campaigns were peaceful expeditions or imperial flexing with a moral agenda. You, as a man who just helped torch a kingdom before lunch, have your own opinions. As the fleet begins to reassemble days later, you climb aboard your ship again, half deaf from the drums and with a tan that borders on third-degree burn. You pass the bound prisoners in silence. They don't beg, they don't speak, they just stare at the sea, perhaps wondering where their lives went sideways. The fleet sails home under red banners and cloudy skies, and you, sunburnt, bruised, and very much done with diplomacy, watch as the coast of Ceylon disappears behind you, still smouldering. Sleep comes easily that night, even as your hammock swings wildly with the waves. After all, nothing rocks you to sleep quite like surviving a royal kidnapping. This time, you're cold again. Not medieval winter in Europe cold, but a harsher, emptier chill. Dry wind cuts through your ragged wool cloak as you pull it tighter. You're in Central Asia, the early 13th century, and the scent of horse sweat and iron is thick in the air. You squint at the horizon, but all you see is dust, and it's moving, fast. You already know what's coming. You're a foot soldier in the Khwarezmian Empire, stationed near the city of Nishapur. You've heard rumors Genghis Khan is coming, or rather, his general Subutai is, and that's somehow worse. The Mongols are the stuff of nightmares, horsemen who shoot backward while riding at full gallop, who drink fermented milk, who never ever stop. You shift nervously as a cloud of hooves roars into view. In less time than it takes to whisper a prayer, the first arrows are already falling. Mongol tactics are simple but brutally effective. Encircle, divide, destroy. You've been trained in close combat, sword and shield, but they never taught you how to fight an enemy you can't even reach. The siege of Nishapur in 1221 isn't one of the most famous Mongol campaigns, but oh, it should be. It's one of the bloodiest. In a world already stunned by Mongol brutality, this massacre stands out. Historians still debate the actual trigger. The story goes that a relative of Genghis Khan, possibly his son-in-law, was killed in Nishapur, supposedly by a sniper's arrow during a tense occupation. Whether the death was an accident or an ambush is unclear. What is clear is Genghis's response: total annihilation. You're stationed just outside the city when it begins. The Mongols don't announce their intentions. They surround Nishapur, cut off all escape, and begin a slow, methodical siege. You're drafted into the defense effort, man the walls, boil oil, hurl insults. But deep down, everyone knows resistance is pointless. The Mongols don't just kill soldiers, they erase cities. After 2 weeks the walls fall. Now if you're squeamish, skip ahead. But remember, we promised no explicit gore, just historically accurate insomnia fuel. The Mongols enter Nishapur like a black tide, and within hours the city is silent. Then comes the cleanup. What happens next remains one of the most infamous alleged mass killings in medieval history. One chronicler claims over 1.7 million people were killed, though modern historians think the number was more likely around 100,000 to 200,000, still staggeringly high for the 13th century. Some sources say the Mongols stacked skulls into pyramids, others describe the complete destruction of the city's irrigation systems and libraries, as if they wanted to erase Nishapur from memory itself. And here's the detail that always catches people. It wasn't Genghis Khan who ordered the final purge, it was his daughter, the widow of the slain son-in-law. According to some sources, she requested that every man, woman and child in the city be killed in revenge. Genghis, being the kind of supportive father you don't want, granted her request. Historians still argue over whether this was mythologized later to justify the scale of destruction. But in the moment, you're not thinking about future textbooks. You're hiding in the rubble of a collapsed bathhouse, clutching a water flask and trying to slow your breathing. You hear hoofbeats. A Mongol scout rides past, silent and alert. You press your back to the wall. There's a fringe theory that a few neighborhoods were spared, artisans maybe, or translators, but you wouldn't bet your life on that. You crawl deeper into the ruins, past scorched tapestries and broken doors. A burnt wooden sign reads, House of Scholars. You step around it. A quirky detail. Mongol forces often kept engineers and city planners alive to help them build better cities, or destroy others more efficiently. If you had skills in mathematics or irrigation, you might be spared. If your best talent was bread making or sarcastic poetry, well, hope the next life's kinder. Night falls. The city glows faintly from the still burning embers. You find shelter in a collapsed granary and wrap yourself in a sack of barley to sleep. Around you, the silence is profound, unnatural. It's not the peace of victory. It's the silence that follows the erasure of an entire population. When the Mongols ride off weeks later, there's not much left behind. Just broken pottery, blackened bricks and stories whispered by the wind. You emerge from hiding, blinking at the sunlight, and wonder what you'll do next. You're not even sure where next is, but for now, you're alive, and in 1221 Nishapur, that makes you rarer than gold. You wake up to the sound of chanting, deep, rhythmic and echoing through stone corridors. But this isn't a monastery. It's a fortress carved into a cliff, and you're about to witness one of the strangest, most stubborn standoffs of the medieval world. The year is 137, the place Masada in the Levant. Wait, no, not that Masada. This one is in Tunisia, and it's not Jewish rebels fighting the Romans. It's the last holdout of the Hafsid dynasty, besieged by the Marinid Sultanate of Morocco. If none of those names ring a bell, you're not alone. This chapter of medieval history tends to be overshadowed by shinier European battles. But make no mistake, the siege of El Hamma Fortress is a hidden gem in the Museum of Stubborn Last Stands. You're an apprentice cook, probably the least qualified person to be here, and yet here you are, stuck inside a sun-scorched stone labyrinth with maybe 800 Hafsid loyalists and no realistic hope of survival. The Marinids have cut off water, trade routes, even birds. You haven't seen a pigeon in weeks. And pigeons were the emergency alert system. Every morning your job is to stretch the rations, stale millet cakes, dried figs and one communal goat that's beginning to look increasingly nervous. The fortress itself is impressive. High walls, built-in aqueducts and multiple inner courtyards designed to confuse attackers. It's also boiling hot by midday and freezing by midnight. Sleep is a suggestion at this point. The Marinids, for their part, are patient. They have time, troops and more goats than you. Each day they move their siege engines a little closer, towers of wood and hide, designed to hurl massive stones at your walls and occasionally set things on fire for fun. You try not to flinch every time one lands nearby, but your ears still ring from yesterday's impact. Here's where it gets weird. The Hafsid defenders don't collapse. They dig underground tunnels, sending out nighttime raids to steal supplies or sabotage the siege towers. At one point, they even catapulted dead livestock over their own walls just to convince the enemy they weren't starving. Spoiler, they very much were. Historians still argue whether this was sheer desperation or brilliant psychological warfare. Either way, it bought them time. But then, disaster. A traitor inside the fortress signals to the Marinids, revealing a weak point in the western wall. You wake one morning to find the sky filled with arrows. They've breached the outer gate. Now it's chaos. You grab a kitchen knife and run, not entirely sure where you're going. Through the corridors, past collapsed archways and smoke-drenched courtyards, you dodge falling debris and listen for the sounds of pursuit. Somewhere, someone is blowing a conch horn, which is either a signal for retreat or just a really committed panic response. Eventually, the fortress falls. The remaining defenders either die fighting or are captured. The Marinids, in a move typical of medieval siege warfare, offer no clemency. It's not personal, it's strategic. The more brutal the end, the less likely the next group is to resist. Scholars estimate that nearly 5,000 lives were lost in this 3-month siege between skirmishes, starvation, disease, and the final massacre. It doesn't sound like a Mongol-scale number, but considering the scale of the region and population, it was a catastrophic depopulation of the area. The town surrounding the fortress never fully recovered, a quirky little detail. The Marinids later converted the ruins into a summer retreat. They liked the view. You, miraculously, survive by crawling into a collapsed food cellar with your goat friend. You've named him Couscous. You live off pickled olives and stale wine for a week before the dust settles and the new regime decides you're harmless enough to spare. They don't even take your knife. Maybe they respect a good cook. When the smoke clears and the walls stop crumbling, you look out over the scorched desert. You're thinner, hungrier, wiser, not likely, but definitely more aware of how stubborn humans can be when cornered. You pat Couscous on the head, whisper "we made it," and drift into the first real sleep you've had in months. It's dreamless, just a soft hum of wind over ancient stone. The smoke in your nose smells different this time. Less like burning buildings, more like burning spices. You're no longer in North Africa or Central Asia. This time, your feet are sinking into the muddy banks of the Ganges River, somewhere near Bengal in the early 14th century. The air is thick, wet, and filled with the songs of birds that don't care how many kingdoms are currently burning. You're a low-ranking infantryman, pressed into the service of the Delhi Sultanate under Muhammad bin Tughlaq. You didn't exactly choose this career path. One day you were helping your uncle sell tamarind paste at the market, and the next a tax officer informed you that your village owed soldiers instead of coin this season. So here you are, wearing armor 2 sizes too big, stuck in a war that doesn't seem to know which direction it's going, and to be fair, neither does your sultan. Muhammad bin Tughlaq is brilliant, educated, and how shall we put this gently, completely out of his mind. He's known for issuing sweeping reforms and then completely reversing them. One day he relocates the capital of the empire, hundreds of miles south to Dawlatabad, forcing the entire population to walk there. Then he changes his mind and orders everyone to walk back. If this sounds exhausting to you, congratulations, you have basic empathy. Historians still argue whether he was a misunderstood genius or simply disastrously impulsive. Either way, he liked to wage campaigns into the eastern edges of the subcontinent, territory lush with rivers, elephants, and rebellious governors. You're part of one such expedition into Bengal, where a local rebellion has been smoldering for years. But unlike the open-field warfare of Europe or the cavalry charges of the Mongols, this is slow, swampy attrition. The roads are choked with mud, the air is thick with mosquitoes, and you've lost more comrades to fever than to swords. Still, the Battle of Aigala in 1325 becomes infamous for one reason: its sheer grinding pointlessness. Tughlaq's forces number in the tens of thousands, but they're disorganized, half-starved, and terrified of local jungle warfare tactics. Bengal's defenders, meanwhile, know every stream and tree route in the region. They wage a war of patience, striking from cover and disappearing before retaliation. They poison wells, scatter supplies, and lure troops into snake-infested marshes. You're not really fighting anymore. You're surviving the world's most miserable camping trip. At night, the jungle is alive with noise, howling jackals, buzzing insects, and the occasional panicked soldier running from what might have been a tiger, or just an especially aggressive monkey. Your boots never dry, your rations turn moldy within hours, and the sky won't stop raining. Then, after months of slogging through this green nightmare, Tughlaq does what he always does. He gives up. No dramatic charge, no decisive siege. He simply declares the campaign unnecessary, gathers the surviving troops, and begins the long, wet, disease-ridden march back to Delhi. You don't even feel disappointed, just relieved. As you load your soaked boots into a makeshift raft, you spot a snake coiled on your sword and decide it can keep it. A few chronicles report casualty numbers as high as 30,000, but these are likely exaggerated. Still, the campaign left thousands dead, not from combat, but from heatstroke, dysentery, and sheer mismanagement. A quirky side note: Tughlaq tried to invent a new currency around this time, made of brass instead of gold. Unfortunately, everyone just started minting their own coins at home, and the economy collapsed faster than your health in Bengal. You finally arrive back in Delhi, a walking skeleton, and are greeted by silence. No parades, no medals, not even a thank you snack, just more mud. Later, when you think back on your time in Bengal, you remember the trees, always rustling, as if they were laughing at you. You're not sure they were wrong. The sand this time feels soft under your feet. Too soft. It slips and slides with each step, making you question why armies ever thought desert warfare was a good idea. But here you are in the early 16th century, marching through the Sahara with a linen-wrapped head and a growing suspicion that today's going to be your last. The year is 1591, and you're part of a Moroccan invasion force headed straight for the Songhai Empire, one of the most powerful and sophisticated kingdoms in West Africa. You're sweating under chainmail armor, wondering why your commander thought crossing 1,500 miles of desert was a solid military plan. This is the Battle of Tondibi, and you've got a front-row seat to one of the weirdest mismatches in medieval military history: gunpowder versus cattle. You're one of about 4,000 Moroccan soldiers, armed with early firearms and cannons, which feel cool at first until you realize how heavy they are. You're not sure what Songhai cavalry looks like, but you're about to find out. You see, the Songhai were not amateurs. They had a vast, wealthy empire with elite troops, a deep knowledge of the terrain, and a capital city, Gao, that scholars still say rivaled any European court. And the Songhai army, it's massive. Some say over 40,000 strong. You gulp. But your commander, Judar Pasha, has a plan. He's a Spanish eunuch leading a Moroccan army into a foreign continent. He thinks firearms will give you the edge. You're not so sure. When the Songhai finally appear, it's not with the thunder of horses but the low, earthy rumble of oxen. They've strapped flaming torches to the backs of hundreds of cattle and sent them straight at your lines. Yes, flaming cattle. It works about as well as you'd imagine. Your front lines panic. The cattle are on fire, screaming and charging blindly. Men trip, gunpowder ignites, camels bolt. The first hour of the battle is just chaos and confusion, with cannon fire echoing over the dunes and more than a few Moroccan troops seriously reconsidering their career paths. But once the cattle stampede fizzles, your side rallies. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Moroccan firearms prove too much. Songhai archers and cavalry can't get close without being cut down. The cannons make a terrifying debut. You've never seen what cannonballs do to tightly packed formations before, and frankly, you'd rather not see it again. The Songhai lines collapse by midday. Historians still argue whether the battle was won by technology, terrain, or sheer dumb luck. Either way, the loss at Tondibi shatters Songhai dominance. Their empire begins to splinter. Within a decade, it's gone. But here's the twist. The Moroccan victory doesn't last either. Though your side wins the battle, you can't hold the territory. Disease, local rebellions, and logistical nightmares make it impossible to maintain control. The desert, it seems, has no allegiance. You're among the few survivors. You didn't fire a shot. You were too busy hiding under a camel cart, watching your musket rust from spilled water. Still, you march home with your unit, trailing sand from every crevice of your body, ears still ringing from cannon blasts, and a newfound fear of cows. A quirky postscript. Some legends say a few surviving Songhai generals tried to rally in the jungles, becoming folk heroes in the oral traditions of West Africa. You hear their names whispered in markets years later, part history, part myth. Back in Morocco, you're given a small pension and a ceremonial dagger, which is basically a fancy paperweight. You never return to the desert. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rustles through your window just right, you swear you can hear hooves and flames and feel the heat of a burning ox barreling toward your dreams. This time you don't land in a desert, a jungle, or a wind-blown steppe. No, tonight you find yourself knee-deep in mud again. But this time it's the cold, sticky, soul-sapping kind that only medieval France can deliver. It's 1356, and you're standing in a damp field outside the city of Poitiers, adjusting the straps on your helmet and praying to literally any god who might be listening. You're a French peasant levied into military service, which means you got a spear, a crust of bread, and a promise of glory. What you actually got was a miserable week of marching, half a tent and a pair of boots that gave up back in Bordeaux. Your noble commanders keep calling this a glorious confrontation, but you've heard rumors. Something about longbows. Something about the English being terrifyingly good at not dying. This is the Battle of Poitiers, and it's going to be an absolute catastrophe for France. Your side, the French, outnumbers the English nearly 3-1. Over 20,000 knights, foot soldiers and crossbowmen, under King John II, a monarch known for his bravery, fancy armor, and impressive collection of increasingly bad decisions. The English? Maybe 6,000 men at most, led by Edward, the Black Prince, who sounds like a comic book villain but is, in fact, just a really good field commander with a thing for surprise tactics and aggressive flanking. Historians still argue whether the French lost because of overconfidence or just terrible leadership. You think it might have been both. The French nobles insist on fighting mounted, because walking into battle like commoners is apparently worse than dying. You, however, are very much walking and very much in the front. The battle begins at dawn. You don't hear trumpets. You hear thwip, 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 the unmistakable sound of longbow arrows slicing through the air. The English archers are insanely accurate, firing tens of thousands of arrows that punch through armor, pierce horseflesh, and turn your line into a very organized panic. Within an hour, the cavalry charge is a smoking ruin. Knights in heavy armor collapse into muddy ditches. Horses flail. You're just trying not to get stepped on. Then comes the final humiliation. King John himself is captured. Yes, captured. The King of France is literally yanked off his horse and taken prisoner by a bunch of exhausted, muddy Englishmen. His ornate battle gear is so fancy that he's instantly recognized, which was a tactical disaster and a fashion critique all in one. The battle ends with a staggering French loss. Nearly 8,000 French soldiers are dead, compared to a few hundred English. The rest either flee or are captured for ransom. You're one of the lucky ones. You escape by hiding under the body of a very flat nobleman and pretending to be unconscious. You're surprisingly good at this. A quirky detail: King John ends up being treated like a VIP guest in London. He's given comfortable quarters, allowed to bring his entourage, and even goes hunting with English nobles. You hear later that he voluntarily returns to captivity after escaping, because apparently the French court refused to pay his ransom and he felt guilty. Royal honor is weird. You, on the other hand, return home broke, bruised, and not entirely sure France still exists. Local lords are panicking. The nobility is in shambles. The 100 Years' War just got a whole lot messier. Sometimes, while tilling your sad patch of cabbage field, you wonder what would have happened if you'd been born on the English side. Maybe you'd be rich, dry, and missing fewer teeth. But then you remember the arrows, the screaming, and that one guy who tried to parry a warhorse, and you figure, nah, everyone was doomed. You're wading through tall grass now. There's mist hanging low to the ground, and the air is thick with the scent of bloodroot and gunpowder. A few fireflies dart past your face, unfazed by the army slowly creeping through the Andean foothills. You're a Spanish foot soldier, and tonight you're marching toward a city that glows with gold, or so they say. It's the year 1536, and you're standing on the brink of the siege of Cusco, the heart of the once mighty Inca Empire. You were promised treasure, adventure, and eternal glory. What you got was altitude sickness, frostbite, and some very unhappy locals with slingshots that can knock a man's teeth out at 100 paces. See, this is what happens when you conquer an empire and then forget that its people are not thrilled about it. 2 years ago, Francisco Pizarro and his band of conquistadors captured Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, and more or less dismantled the empire. But what the Spanish didn't realize is that Cusco, the Inca capital, wasn't just a place, it was a symbol. And you're about to become part of the Inca's revenge story. The uprising is led by Manco Inca Yupanqui, a royal who had originally tried cooperating with the Spaniards before realizing they were, to put it kindly, the worst roommates imaginable. So now he's rallying tens of thousands of Inca warriors to lay siege to Cusco, where a few hundred Spaniards, including you, are holed up in a city that suddenly feels way too small. Historians still debate the size of the opposing forces. Some say Manco Inca had up to 100,000 fighters, others think it was more like 40,000. Either way, you are outnumbered by an absurd amount. The Inca strategy is genius. Encircle the city, cut off supply lines, and wear the invaders down through constant raids, ambushes, and psychological warfare. Every night, the mountains echo with chants and war horns. Every day, another column of smoke rises from a Spanish outpost. You and your fellow conquistadors are fortified in ancient stone buildings using the thick Inca walls for shelter. You're running out of food, morale is crumbling, even the war horses look confused. At one point, you try eating roasted guinea pig, not for the first time, and discover that you actually like it. That's how weird this siege has gotten. Inca warriors unleash flaming arrows, rolling boulders, and at one point, an army of women armed with clubs, which makes more than one Spanish soldier deeply reconsider his life choices. You've never seen more innovative uses for rope, fire, and slingshots in your life. Some Inca slingers can hit a helmet from 300 feet. You try not to peek out from the parapets too often. Weeks pass, then months. It's supposed to be summer, but the Andes don't care about your calendar. You're cold, hungry, and constantly itchy. One guy swears he saw a condor stealing bread from the camp kitchen. You believe him. Cusco's defenses are holding for now, but reinforcements aren't coming fast enough. You feel the city tightening around you like a noose made of ancient stone and bad decisions. Finally, in a desperate move, Spanish reinforcements arrive from Lima, breaking through the siege lines with a mixture of bribery, cavalry, and sheer recklessness. The Inca forces retreat, not defeated, but outmaneuvered. The siege ends after 10 brutal months, and though the Spanish technically hold Cusco, they've been spiritually rattled. The myth of total control is shattered. This wasn't a skirmish, it was an earthquake. Quirky detail. During the siege, Manco Inca supposedly launched messages by llama runners between his mountain forts. Some of those runners covered over 100 miles in a single day wearing sandals. You, meanwhile, haven't changed socks in 6 weeks. After the siege, Manco retreats into the jungle, where he establishes a rebel Inca state that endures for nearly 4 decades. He never gives up, never surrenders. You hear rumors about him for years to come. A ghost emperor in the clouds. Back in Cusco, the streets feel quieter. The gold isn't as shiny as you thought it would be. You survived, but you're not sure what that even means anymore. You're soaked to the bone, shivering in your armor, and wondering for the 3rd time this morning whether your horse is planning to throw you into a swamp. Welcome to medieval Poland, circa 1410, and you, lucky soul, are riding with the Teutonic Knights, a militant religious order with shiny white cloaks, giant crosses, and the unfortunate habit of picking fights with people who vastly outnumber them. This, dear insomniac traveller, is the Battle of Grunwald, one of the largest and most significant battles of the medieval period, and you're right in the middle of it, or rather, on the slightly overconfident side. Let's set the scene. Your leaders, the Teutonic Grand Masters, believe they've got the edge in strategy and discipline. You've got well-trained knights, crossbowmen, and German engineering on your side. Your opponents? a massive allied army of Polish, Lithuanian and Tatar troops, led by King Władysław Jagiello and Grand Duke Vytautas, who are playing an impressively long game of military chess. The Teutonic Order is confident, perhaps too confident. You spend most of the early morning waiting in tight formation, baking under the July sun in your armor, while the enemy seems to take their sweet time forming up. You hear birds, you hear the clinking of mail, you try not to fall asleep. Then, out of nowhere, the Lithuanian cavalry charges. It's fast, chaotic and wild. The Teutonic lines hold briefly, and you think, ah yes, order shall prevail. But no, the charge was a feint, and when the Lithuanian troops withdraw into the forest, the Teutonic commanders believe it's a full-blown retreat. Cue collective overconfidence. Historians still debate whether the Lithuanians actually panicked, or if this was a brilliant bait-and-smash tactic. Either way, it works. Because while the Teutonic knights surge forward to chase the retreating Lithuanians, the Polish heavy cavalry slams into your flanks like an avalanche made of chainmail and bad decisions. The battlefield devolves into complete chaos: mud, trampled grass, horses shrieking, and banners torn to ribbons. You swing your sword once, maybe twice, and then a Tatar arrow lodges itself in your shield. You drop it and run. More than 50,000 troops are involved in this clash. It rages for hours. By mid-afternoon, the Teutonic lines are splintered. Grandmaster Ulrich von Jungingen charges into the thickest fighting with his elite bodyguards and is killed almost immediately. The Order's banner falls, so does your morale. You trip over a dismembered lance and lie flat in the mud, hoping the Polish knights won't notice that you're pretending to be dead. It's oddly relaxing down here. Quiet, cool. You try not to breathe too loudly. By sunset, the Teutonic Order is devastated. Thousands of knights and soldiers lie scattered across the field. The battlefield becomes a mass grave, and the Order's iron grip over Eastern Europe begins to rust. They'll never fully recover from this loss. And here's a curious twist. Despite the massive victory, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance doesn't push immediately into the Teutonic capital, Marienburg. Historians still argue whether that was due to logistics, weather, or political caution. Either way, the opportunity to finish off the knights for good is missed. As for you, you crawl out of the mud 2 days later, steal a potato from a local farm, and start walking west. You vow never to fight again, but 6 months later, you're back in another border skirmish, because peasant pensions aren't what they used to be. Every now and then you think about the white crosses, the shimmer of Polish armor in the sun, and the sheer absurdity of it all. You wonder if anyone will remember that day. Turns out they will. The Battle of Grunwald becomes a foundational myth for Poland, Lithuania, and even Ukraine. Artists paint it, poets romanticize it. And you get a sore shoulder, and a story no one believes. The morning sun creeps through a thin veil of dust. You squint, your lips cracked, your throat dry, and you're already regretting today. Welcome to India. The year is 1526, and you're a weary foot soldier under the command of Ibrahim Lodi, Sultan of Delhi. You've marched all the way to the plains of Panipat, and so far all you've seen are tired war elephants, grumbling generals, and a sky that can't decide if it wants to blind you or choke you. You're supposed to defend the heart of northern India from a newcomer, a man named Babur, who claims to be descended from both Tamerlane and Genghis Khan. You think, okay, sure, sounds impressive, but also he only brought around 15,000 men. Your side, more than 100,000, including elephants, artillery, and cavalry that's been trained since birth. It should be an easy win. And yet there's something different about Babur. He's got cannons, that's the first thing. You've never seen cannons used like this. Not just parked out front and boomed dramatically, but mounted on carriages, dragged by oxen, and placed behind a defensive barricade made from carts, ropes, and spiked chains, a two-lugma formation borrowed from Central Asian warfare. Historians still argue whether Babur's genius was in his firepower or in how he forced Lodi to attack him head-on. Either way, the result is devastating. You spend most of the morning standing in formation, packed elbow to elbow in sweltering heat, listening to elephants trumpet and commanders argue. Then, without much warning, Babur's men begin pounding your lines with mobile cannon fire, turning your front ranks into twisted heaps of metal and limbs. The elephants charge, but as they approach Babur's lines, the explosions spook them. The great beasts panic, turning around and ploughing back into your own infantry. Suddenly, your side is fighting itself, and you're desperately trying not to get flattened. Then comes Babur's cavalry, sweeping in from the flanks in tight, fast-moving columns. You barely see them coming through the smoke. One moment you're holding a spear, the next you're on the ground, breath knocked out of you, wondering if your foot is still attached. By midday, it's not a battle, it's a slaughter. Ibrahim Lodi is killed in the chaos, along with over 20,000 of his soldiers. You somehow survive by hiding under an overturned drum cart, which smells like old milk and horse sweat, but saves your life. Babur doesn't just win, he changes the entire trajectory of the Indian subcontinent. This battle marks the beginning of the Mughal Empire, one of the most powerful and culturally rich empires in world history, and all because one man brought gunpowder and discipline to a battlefield, still ruled by elephants and outdated egos, a quirky detail. Babur, being the poetic type, writes about the battle in his memoirs, the Baburnama. He describes the field, the tactics, even his breakfast that morning. Meanwhile, you've forgotten what breakfast tastes like. Later, as you limp back to your village, you tell the tale of Panipat again and again. You describe the thunder of cannons, the way the ground shook, the smell of burnt silk and iron. No one believes you. They say no army that small could win. You shrug. You were there, and you're not even sure how you made it out alive. The desert stretches endlessly before you, shimmering in the heat. Your sandals are full of sand, your skin smells like old bronze and onions, and every time you blink, you taste dust. You're in ancient Egypt, around 1274 BCE, and today you're marching into one of history's earliest recorded battles, the Battle of Kadesh. You serve under Ramesses II, the pharaoh who insists he's the living god Horus. He's young, full of confidence, and wears more eyeliner than seems reasonable in wartime. You, however, are a humble spearman, part of the vast Egyptian army heading north to reclaim territory from the Hittites, a formidable empire in Anatolia that isn't thrilled about Egypt poking around its borders. As you march, the Nile fades behind you, replaced by dry plains and narrow mountain passes. You hear whispers that the Hittites are nearby, but scouts report they're far to the north. Ramesses, never one to shy away from a grand entrance, decides to camp near the city of Kadesh alone with his Ammon division, believing the rest of the army will catch up soon. It's a bold move, a very bold move, and it's also a trap. Turns out the Hittites aren't far away. They're very close, hiding behind the city with a massive army, possibly over 37,000 men, including 3,500 chariots, the tanks of the Bronze Age. Ramesses has fallen for a brilliant deception, and the Egyptians are suddenly ambushed. Historians still argue over the numbers, strategies, and even the outcome. The only detailed sources we have are Egyptian, and let's just say Ramesses was not shy about embellishing his heroics. You're in the camp when the Hittite chariots storm in, dust clouds rising, horns blaring, tents are crushed under iron wheels. The enemy appears like a wall of wood and thunder. You grab your spear and run, mostly in circles, trying not to get trampled. Ramesses, he's in the middle of the chaos, possibly surrounded, possibly narrating his own greatness out loud. According to inscriptions later carved into temple walls by his orders, of course he single-handedly held off the Hittites until reinforcements arrived. Realistically, it was probably his personal guard and the Naran division, possibly foreign mercenaries who turned the tide. You, meanwhile, have dived headfirst into a crate of date cakes to avoid the fighting. Somehow, you survive. The battle ends in a stalemate, or maybe a mild Hittite win, but both sides spin it as a victory. Ramesses builds temples and carvings showing himself as a divine warrior, while the Hittites likely nod and think, "Sure, buddy." Eventually the two empires sign one of the world's first recorded peace treaties, even agreeing to return prisoners and not raid each other's temples. Very civilized for ancient times. Quirky detail. Some scholars think Kadesh featured the largest chariot battle in world history, with up to 6,000 chariots clashing in the dust. You were too busy crying behind a pottery pile to notice. Afterward, you returned to Thebes, covered in bruises, with a new respect for wheels, and a deep desire never to hear the word Kadesh again. Ramesses lives for another 60 years, marries multiple queens and possibly one of his daughters, don't ask, and declares himself the greatest pharaoh to ever live. Oh! You spend the next year telling anyone who'll listen that you saw the divine Ramesses leap onto his chariot and slay 2,000 Hittites with one throw of a spear. No one believes you, but they do buy you drinks. You're standing in an open field, trying very hard not to sneeze. The gunpowder smoke is thick, and someone next to you is muttering a prayer in Latin. Welcome to Central Europe. The year is 1631, and you're about to witness the Battle of Breitenfeld, a pivotal moment in the 30 Years' War, and one of the bloodiest military conflicts in European history. You're in the army of Johann Tserclaes, Count of Tilly, commander of the Catholic League. He's experienced, ruthless, and incredibly superstitious. You've spent the past few weeks marching through muddy villages, burning the occasional Protestant farmstead, and eating nothing but hard bread and bitter cabbage soup. Morale is bleak. Across the field, a new player has entered the game, Gustavus Adolphus, the so-called Lion of the North, King of Sweden. His Protestant army is smaller but far more modern. You've heard stories, flexible formations, rotating volleys, light artillery, soldiers who can actually read. You assume they're exaggerated. They're not. The Swedish army doesn't look like much from a distance, just blue and yellow uniforms, well-drilled lines, and lots of small cannons mounted on wagons. No heavy cavalry charging wildly, no massive wings of pikemen stretching across the hills. just neat little units that look alarmingly efficient. The battle begins with Catholic artillery, pounding the Swedish lines, but the Swedes respond with mobile cannons that reposition between volleys. It's like playing chess against someone who's memorized the next 6 moves. As part of the Catholic infantry, you're placed in the middle of the line, near the tercio, a dense, square-shaped unit of pikemen and musketeers. It's big, slow, and awkward. Meanwhile, the Swedes deploy in sleeker brigades, designed for speed and flexibility. Around midday, the real disaster begins. Tilly orders a full assault, assuming he can smash the Swedish center. It works for about 15 minutes. Then, the Swedish wings sweep forward with terrifying precision. Field commanders rotate their musketeers, firing in overlapping patterns. The Catholic troops, slow and crammed together, can't return fire fast enough. You try to reload, but your powder's damp, your match cord fizzles. You curse, drop your musket, and duck. The Swedes crack your left flank, sending your comrades running in all directions. Horsemen sweep in, sabers flashing, but it's not blood and chaos that sticks with you, it's the order. The eerie calm of the Swedish infantry, the quiet confidence. It's like watching clockwork carve through jelly. Tilly is wounded and carried from the field. Your unit, now leaderless, gets bogged down in a swampy ditch. You pretend to be dead again. This is becoming a theme, and wait until the sounds of battle fade. By the end of the day, the Catholic League has lost over 7,000 men, with many more captured. The Swedes, fewer than 2,000 casualties. It's not just a victory, it's a revolution in warfare. Historians still argue whether Gustavus truly invented modern warfare, but most agree he redefined the battlefield. Flexible lines, mobile artillery, officer training. It was no longer about brute force and divine favor, but discipline and design. A fringe theory, some say Gustavus studied ancient Roman manuals and borrowed ideas from Maurice of Nassau, creating a hybrid doctrine ahead of its time. All you know is you never want to hear a Swedish marching drum again. After the battle, Gustavus becomes a Protestant hero. His army marches deeper into the Holy Roman Empire, and the war drags on for another 17 years. The 30 Years' War kills millions, through famine, disease and violence. You somehow survive, retire early, and move to a tiny village where no one asks questions, and the beer is strong. Sometimes you dream of blue uniforms moving in perfect rhythm. Other times you just dream of dry socks. You wake up to the sound of marching boots and distant cannon fire. Your legs are stiff, your coat smells like wet dog and bad decisions, and your commanding officer is arguing with a map. It's 1812, you're in Russia, and yes, you're part of Napoleon Bonaparte's Grande Armée on its ill-fated invasion of the East. And oh boy, you picked the wrong campaign. Your journey began months ago with fanfare, music, and shiny buttons. Over 600,000 soldiers, from France, Italy, Poland, Germany, even Spain, joined what was supposed to be the Emperor's ultimate triumph. You expected glory, loot, maybe a fancy medal. What you got instead was mud, mosquitoes, and starvation. The Battle of Borodino is your first and likely last real fight in this campaign. The date is September 7th, and you're camped just outside a sleepy Russian village, whose name you'll never forget. Because what happens today is the bloodiest single-day battle of the Napoleonic Wars, and you're right in the middle of it. Your boots squelch in churned-up dirt as the sun rises. You clutch your musket, already damp, and march toward a position nicknamed the Raversky Redoubt, a Russian fortification bristling with cannons and musket barrels. Ahead, the French artillery opens fire, turning the field into a hellscape of smoke and flying limbs. Napoleon, oddly cautious today, refuses to commit his Imperial Guard, saving them for a moment that never comes. Historians still argue why. Some say he was unwell, others believe he feared another trap. Whatever the reason, his hesitation costs thousands of lives. You charge the redoubt 3 times, the noise is overwhelming. You fire blindly, reload, advance, retreat, reload again. A cannonball removes the man beside you from existence, leaving only his boots. You don't scream, you don't blink, you just keep moving forward, because that's what you've been trained to do. The Russians, under General Kutuzov, fight like cornered animals. Every time you push them back, more seem to appear. They've dug trenches, planted artillery in tight formations, and built earthworks that swallow your comrades like quicksand. The battlefield becomes a meat grinder. Over 70,000 casualties in just one day. Eventually, the Russians retreat, but not in panic, in strategy. They leave the road to Moscow open, and Napoleon, weary and bleeding victory, follows. Here's the twist. When you reach Moscow, the city is mostly abandoned and on fire. The Russian army has evacuated. and locals have burned their own capital. No supplies, no shelter, no surrender, just smoldering ruins, and the first flurries of a bitter winter. A quirky but true detail: some French officers tried to hold dinner parties in the ruins, setting up tables in fire-damaged palaces. You, however, chew leather straps in the snow, and try to remember what warmth feels like. Eventually, with no choice, Napoleon orders the retreat. What follows is a nightmare march through snow, starvation, and Russian ambushes. Of the original 600,000 soldiers, fewer than 100,000 make it home. You survive by stealing a horse, faking your death, and hiding under a pile of hay near Smolensk. At one point, you eat a candle. Historians call it Napoleon's greatest blunder. Others see it as a turning point in European history, the moment the myth of his invincibility cracked. You just call it the worst vacation ever. Back home, no one believes your stories. You say you saw Moscow burn, that you walked barefoot across frozen rivers, that you once shared a coat with 3 other men. They think you're exaggerating. You let them. But sometimes, late at night, you wake in a sweat, certain you still hear the crunch of snow under starving feet, and the distant rumble of Russian guns. Your boots squish in the tropical mud, as insects the size of your thumb buzz around your face. The air is thick and heavy, like breathing through warm soup. You're not in Europe anymore. You're in Saint-Domingue, the wealthiest colony in the French Empire, and it's the 1790s. Sugar plantations stretch for miles. But you're not here for the sugar. You're here for the revolution. Tonight, everything changes. This is the story of the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in modern history, and one of the bloodiest chapters in the age of revolutions. You're just a low-ranking French soldier, freshly shipped in to restore order. You were told this would be a quick operation. You were told wrong. It starts with whispers. Enslaved Africans organizing in the cane fields, using coded drumming rhythms to plan a massive uprising. One night, thousands of enslaved people rise up almost simultaneously across the northern plains. Plantations burn, masters flee, and suddenly, the richest colony in the Western Hemisphere is on fire. You're sent in to crush the revolt. But this isn't like any war you've known. Your uniform is soaked through with sweat. Mosquitoes give you fevers that melt your brain. You march all day, and get ambushed in the jungle at night. The enemy, former slaves turned soldiers, many of whom know the terrain better than you ever will. One name echoes everywhere: Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, a brilliant tactician, and one of the most unlikely generals in history. His troops use guerrilla tactics, hit and run, ambushes, terrain advantage. They melt into the forest, reappear on the hills, and somehow never seem tired. Historians still debate how Toussaint rose so fast. Was he a self-taught genius? Did he secretly study European war manuals? Was he just really good at improvising? Either way, you're on the losing end of his strategy. The French try everything. They send in fresh troops. They offer emancipation to anyone who joins their side. Then, they change their minds, and try to re-enslave the population, a decision that backfires spectacularly. The rebels, now fighting for both freedom and vengeance, become even more determined. You're stationed near a river town when the fever hits. Yellow fever. It kills more soldiers than bullets ever could. One day you're training with your musket, the next you're coughing up blood and seeing stars in daylight. Doctors recommend leeches and rum. One works better than the other. Meanwhile, Toussaint negotiates, manipulates, and outmaneuvers both British and Spanish forces, who also try to claim the island. By the time Napoleon sends 30,000 elite troops to retake Saint-Domingue, led by his brother-in-law Leclerc, the rebels are battle-hardened, ready, and more importantly, familiar with the land and its diseases. Quirky fact: many of the rebel soldiers wore white linen coats, mimicking the French uniforms, but often fought barefoot. It gave them better grip in the mud, and made their charge especially terrifying. Eventually, Toussaint is captured through treachery, and shipped off to France, where he dies in a cold prison. But the revolution doesn't die with him. His protégé, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, takes over, and if you thought Toussaint was relentless, Dessalines is fire incarnate. In 1804, after years of brutal warfare, Dessalines declares independence. Saint-Domingue is no more. The island is now Haiti, the first black republic, and the first nation born from a slave revolt. You survive, barely, and return to France with a limp, 1,000-yard stare, and a deep fear of jungle noises. The French Empire, it loses its crown jewel, and starts looking towards selling Louisiana to cover the cost. Yes, that Louisiana purchase. Historians call the Haitian Revolution a miracle, a tragedy, a precedent, and a paradox. Some say it helped spark abolitionist movements around the globe, others say it scared slaveholding nations into cracking down harder. You just remember running for your life while men with machetes moved through the cane like shadows, fighting not for kings or countries, but for the right to sleep free. You're knee-deep in mud again. Surprise. But this time you're also freezing, soaked and squinting through a fog, so thick it might as well be soup. It's October 25th, 1854, and you're in the Crimean War, specifically the Battle of Balaclava, and even more specifically, about to witness or participate in the absurdly famous Charge of the Light Brigade. Let's just say, your odds are not great. You're a British cavalryman. You've trained on open fields in England, you polish your boots every morning, and your mustache is extremely well maintained. You've also been given a saber, not a gun. That'll be important in a second. The battle begins with the Russians taking key artillery positions on a ridge. Your commanders argue over maps that make no sense. Then, a vague and poorly written order arrives from Lord Raglan: advance rapidly to the front and prevent the enemy from carrying away the guns. Unfortunately, no one's really sure which guns he's talking about. So someone, somewhere in the command chain, decides that you should charge directly into a well-fortified Russian artillery battery, across a mile-long valley, flanked on both sides by more guns, with no infantry or artillery support. It's basically a suicidal mistake wrapped in a miscommunication sandwich. Still, orders are orders. The bugle sounds. You spur your horse forward. Sabres gleam. The 600-odd members of the Light Brigade ride out, straight into history. The first minute is nothing but wind, hooves, and a confusing surge of pride. Then the cannon fire begins. From the front, from the sides, the sky explodes. Horses fall mid-stride. Riders vanish in bursts of dirt and blood. You grip your reins tighter and lower your head, trying not to become abstract art. Historians still argue who exactly was at fault. Raglan, Nolan, Lucan, all three, no one, but everyone agrees on one thing. It was one of the most catastrophically brave moments in military history. The Light Brigade actually reaches the Russian guns somehow. There's a brief, chaotic clash. Sabres against bayonets, shouts in English, Russian, and pure panic. You're thrown from your horse, but manage to scramble behind a broken wheel, swinging wildly at shadows. And then, like smoke, it's over. You limp back across the valley with the survivors, fewer than 200 of the original 600. You've got a cracked rib, a black eye, and a growing hatred for vague leadership. Back at camp, you hear a young soldier muttering poetry. A few weeks later, Alfred, Lord Tennyson writes, "The Charge of the Light Brigade, turning your terrible day into immortal verse." The line, "There's not to reason why," becomes a catchphrase that makes you want to punch something. A quirky tidbit: some of the surviving horses were sent back to Britain and treated like celebrities. One, named Trumpeter, reportedly lived out its days in comfort and appeared in parades. The Crimean War itself is a strange one, a mess of alliances, unclear objectives, and terrible logistics. Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia versus Russia. Thousands die, not just in battle, but from cholera, poor hygiene, and lack of basic medical care. It's also the war that launches the legend of Florence Nightingale, who arrives with lantern in hand and utterly changes battlefield medicine. You're treated by a nurse, who insists you drink something called beef tea, and who yells at surgeons for not washing their hands. It feels revolutionary, and kind of terrifying. Historians often call the charge a beautiful disaster. Some see it as a symbol of honor and duty, others call it an emblem of blind obedience and wasted lives. Either way, you live through it, just barely. Back home, people hail you as a hero. Children ask you what it was like. You usually lie and say, "We rode like thunder," when really all you remember is the sound of your heart pounding, and the sight of the man in front of you falling, silently, from his saddle. And the worst part, you still can't get cannon smoke out of your jacket. The heat hits you like a wall. The moment you step off the transport, you're sweating through your uniform before you've even finished descending the gangplank. You're in Sudan, and the year is 1898. Welcome to the Battle of Omdurman, where colonial arrogance meets machine gun efficiency in one of the most lopsided slaughters in military history. You're a British soldier in Kitchener's Anglo-Egyptian army, here to reclaim Sudan from the mahdist forces, a religious and nationalist movement that back in 1885 shocked the world by capturing Khartoum and killing the famed General Gordon. Now the empire wants its prestige back, and you're part of the retribution tour. The landscape is flat, brown and blinding. There's sand in your boots, your teeth, and probably your soul. You're part of a well-oiled military machine. 20,000 disciplined troops, armed with Maxim machine guns, rifles, artillery, and an absolute mountain of supplies. Opposing you, around 50,000 Sudanese Mahdist warriors, many armed with spears, swords, and a few aging rifles. They wear flowing white robes, chant religious battle cries, and believe they're fighting not just for land, but for divine justice. The next morning, they come, waves and waves of warriors, charge toward your lines. It's not just brave, it's jaw-droppingly surreal.
Ooh.
You're positioned on a hill, behind stacked sandbags, and as you aim your rifle, you wonder if this is going to be a quick skirmish, or something else. It's something else. Your unit opens fire. So does the artillery. The Maxim guns begin their mechanical chattering, a terrifying innovation of modern warfare, mowing down men by the hundreds. You watch as entire battalions of Mahdist fighters fall in synchronized horror. The air fills with dust, blood, and a haunting wail that seems to rise from the ground itself. Within hours the field is littered with over 10,000 dead and wounded Mahdist fighters. The British, fewer than 50 casualties. It's a massacre, and you're not sure if what you did was war or something else entirely. Historians still debate the ethics of this battle. Was it a strategic triumph, a necessary blow to a violent regime, or simply a grotesque display of imperial firepower used against people with no chance of fighting back? One quirky footnote: a young Winston Churchill is here, galloping around on horseback as a war correspondent and part-time cavalry officer. He later writes about the battle with equal parts excitement and unease, calling it the most ghastly sight I have ever witnessed. You return to camp with sand in your ears, and a blank expression. Some of your comrades celebrate, others don't speak at all. The ground outside Omdurman will stink of blood and gunpowder for weeks. The Mahdist state collapses. Sudan is reclaimed, at least from the British perspective, but the victory feels hollow. Later you see a Sudanese fighter's spear planted in the earth like a grave marker, fluttering in the wind. You pause, hand on your rifle, and realize this wasn't just a clash of armies, it was the death rattle of an entire way of life. You survive, technically. You go home. But you never quite shake the image of thousands charging across an open plain into gunfire that never paused, not for breath, not for mercy, not for anything. You dream about it sometimes, and always, it ends the same way, with silence. You're trudging along a foggy riverbank in 1916, Ireland, mud squishing between your toes, the air thick with mist and tension. The world is at war, but not just the Great War on the Western Front. This is a quieter, crueler struggle, unfolding at home, the Easter Rising. You're a foot soldier, a volunteer, not entirely sure why you signed up, but here you are, in the capital, Dublin, surrounded by cobblestones, barricades, and a population too exhausted to flee. The city smells of smoke, bread, and fear. You navigate alleyways where rebels have fortified buildings with anything they can find: tables, crates, even old furniture. Snipers perch in windows. You pass a barricade hastily built from barrels and sacks of flour, and for a moment, the absurdity hits you. These ordinary items, now instruments of war. Historians still argue whether the Rising could have succeeded with better planning, or if it was doomed from the start. The rebellion is small in scale, but huge in symbolism. Around 1,600 Irish volunteers face a garrison of over 16,000 British troops, armed with rifles, artillery, and determination. You sneak past a bakery and hear the faint clatter of dishes, someone trying to keep life normal amid chaos. Your stomach growls, but there's no time for food. The battle is punctuated by bursts of gunfire, shouted orders, and the occasional unexpected quiet that makes your nerves twitch. One quirky detail: some rebels used pigeons to carry messages across the city. Imagine trying to coordinate an uprising with a bird as your main communicator. Somehow, a few messages actually get through, a few don't, and chaos ensues. Hours stretch like days. You climb a narrow staircase in a church tower, heart thumping. From the top, you glimpse the city in turmoil, smoke curling up like lazy fingers, soldiers moving like ants, civilians ducking into doorways. You think of General Connolly and Patrick Pearse, leaders who wrote manifestos and speeches that will outlast all of you. Their words will one day inspire nations, but right now, you're just trying to stay upright, trying not to be caught in a crossfire that feels both random and inevitable. By evening the rebellion falters, buildings surrender, rebels are captured, and the streets fall silent, except for the occasional bark of a distant dog. Casualties mount over 450 dead. British authorities execute 16 leaders, making martyrs of men you may have seen alive just that morning. As you limp back through the mist, you notice graffiti scrawled on a wall, a simple phrase in Irish that roughly translates to, "We fought for something bigger than ourselves." It's haunting in its quietness, and though the rising fails tactically, you sense that this small chaotic week of courage will echo for decades, shaping the future of a nation that will one day claim its independence. The landscape around you is frozen and grey, the wind cutting across the steppe like an invisible whip. It's 1933 Mongolia, and you're part of a small caravan of herders moving across snow-dusted plains. The Great Depression may be ravaging distant continents, but here, survival is measured differently by yak milk, horse stamina, and the unpredictable mercy of winter. You're about to witness one of the deadliest yet strangely overlooked events in modern history, the Mongolian famine of the early 1930s. You trudge alongside families huddled under animal skins, the occasional infant strapped to a mother's back. Historians still argue whether this famine was caused more by Soviet-imposed collectivization policies, environmental misfortune, or a brutal combination of both. Either way, the toll is staggering. You see entire villages reduced to skeletal outlines of themselves, livestock gone, granaries empty. A few elders whisper about past winters, saying they've never felt the cold gnaw so deep into the bones. Food is scarce. You nibble on dried meat, chew yak butter, and taste a hint of snow in the wind. Some families have resorted to eating the leaves of wild plants, roots, even the bark of trees. You feel a gnawing hopelessness in your stomach that no amount of chewing can ease. And yet, despite the hardship, there's a quiet dignity. Children play in the snow, horses graze near the horizon, and herders continue their slow, deliberate routines. It's as if life stubbornly refuses to end, even when it should. A peculiar survival strategy emerges. Families barter handmade tools, felt clothing, and even portions of future harvests for grains or dried meat. You observe a father carefully dividing a small ration of barley among his children, eyes flicking constantly toward the horizon for predators or government inspectors. The rhythm of daily life continues, even under the shadow of starvation. By late winter, some herders have migrated south, others cling to ancestral lands. Estimates suggest that up to a third of Mongolia's population perished, though numbers remain debated, lost among harsh landscapes and poorly kept records. Yet, if you listen closely, you can still hear stories of resilience, whispered from one generation to the next, of families who survived by sheer ingenuity, of communities who shared what little they had. Of the journey you've been on tonight is a long one, stretching across centuries and continents, from dusty plains and foggy streets to frozen steppes and sun-baked deserts. You've seen humanity, at its most extreme, bold, creative, stubborn, sometimes reckless, but always alive, always moving forward. The echoes of battles, famines, rebellions, and everyday lives linger, but now the pace begins to soften. Imagine the sun lowering gently on each landscape you've visited, the dust settling, the smoke fading, the snow quieting under a fading light. Feel the tension of history slowly unwind in your chest, the clang of swords, the rattle of gunfire, the murmur of voices, all now blend into a soft rhythmic hum. You might recall a child in Dublin peeking from a doorway, a Sudanese warrior raising a spear to the sky, or a Mongolian herder pausing to watch the horizon. These images, vivid moments of life from ages past, begin to blur into a gentle montage, as though you are drifting through a museum of time, every exhibit bathed in a calm, amber glow. Your mind can now release the weight of the numbers, the strategies, the staggering losses. Focus instead on the small human threads, a shared meal, a whispered story, a fleeting glance between allies and strangers alike. These fragments are soft enough to let your eyelids grow heavy, yet rich enough to linger in dreams. Now, you can allow your breath to slow, the heart to settle, the muscles to ease. Let the past, in all its vastness and strangeness, cradle you gently. The night is yours, and the world of history has tucked you in. You've walked among warriors, rebels, rulers, and survivors, and you've returned safe, carrying only their whispers. Sleep now, let the stories fade into dreams, carrying their quiet lessons and gentle rhythms with you. The stubborn pulse of life in the cold. You eventually leave the steppe, heart heavy but awed. This isn't a battlefield, nor a court intrigue, nor a siege. It's a quiet, relentless struggle against nature, ideology, and circumstance. And somehow, despite all, you find a certain solemn peace in the endurance you've witnessed, a testament to human will amid the bleakest conditions.